The Rise and Fall of Al Capone, a cinematic chronicle. Privileged. The silent cell. Fraught. The steel door closes with a finality that echoes through the concrete corridors of ALCATRAZ Federal Penitentiary. It is 1939, and the man in cell number 85 barely registers the sound anymore. He sits on the edge of his narrow cot, staring at hands that once commanded an empire, hands that signed orders worth millions, hands that held the fate of entire neighborhoods in their grip. Now those hands tremble slightly as they rest on worn prison trousers, the fingers picking absently at a loose thread. This is not the Al Capone that Chicago remembers. This is not the man who walked into baseball stadiums to thunderous applause, who wore suits that cost more than most men earned in a year, who controlled the flow of illegal alcohol through an entire city and beyond. The guards who pass his cell see only a shell, a confused figure who sometimes forgets where he is, who occasionally calls out for people who are not there, who has been reduced to something less than what he was by an enemy far more relentless than any rival gangster. The disease that courses through his brain cares nothing for reputation. It does not fear the name that once made hardened criminals lower their voices in respect. Neurosyphilis, the doctors called it, a slow execution carried out by microscopic invaders that have been eating away at his mind for years. The infection he contracted as a young man, too ashamed or too reckless to seek treatment, has finally caught up with him. In this moment, on this rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay, the most famous gangster in American history is losing the last battle of his life. But this is not where his story begins. To understand how a man rises to such heights and falls to such depths, we must travel back in time, back to the crowded streets of Brooklyn, back to the immigrant neighborhoods where dreams and desperation walked hand in hand, back to the beginning of a life that would forever change the landscape of American crime.
Part 1. Brooklyn Beginnings. Norwich, January 17, 1899. Snow falls gently on the Brooklyn Navy Yard, dusting the cobblestone streets and the cramped tenement buildings that house thousands of immigrant families. In a modest apartment at 95 Navy Street, Teresa Capone gives birth to her fourth child, a boy they name Alphonse Gabriel Capone. The midwife wraps the infant in clean cloth and hands him to his mother, who holds him close, whispering prayers in Italian. Gabriel Capone, the father, stands nearby, his barber's hands steady and strong, looking at his new son with the quiet hope that every immigrant father carries in his heart. The Capone family had arrived in America 6 years earlier, in 1893, sailing from their home in Angri, a small town in the province of Salerno, just outside Naples. They had come through the port city of Fiume in Austria-Hungary, part of the great wave of Italian immigration that would transform American cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Gabriel was a skilled barber, Teresa a seamstress, and together they worked tirelessly to build a life in their adopted country. They brought with them the traditions of southern Italy, the Catholic faith, the importance of family, and the determination to give their children opportunities they themselves never had. The neighborhood where Alphonse grew up was a world unto itself. The Brooklyn Navy Yard district in those days was a dense patchwork of immigrant communities, where Italian mixed with Irish, Jewish, and Polish families, each group maintaining their own customs while slowly becoming something new, something American. The streets smelled of baking bread and coal smoke, of fish from the markets and the salt air from the harbor. Children played stickball in the narrow alleys while their mothers hung laundry from fire escapes, creating canopies of white sheets that fluttered like flags above the sidewalks. Crimson Alphonse, called Al by his family and friends, was one of 9 children. His older siblings included James Vincenzo, who would later change his name to Richard Hart and become, ironically, a prohibition agent in Nebraska. There was Raffaele, known as Ralph or Bottles, who would eventually take charge of his brother's beverage operations. Salvatore, called Frank, would die young in the service of the family business. Then came the younger ones, Ermina, who died in infancy, Ermino, known as John,
Albert, Matthew, and Mafalda. The Capone household was crowded, noisy, full of life and struggle, a typical immigrant family working to survive and advance in the new world. In 1904, when Al was 5 years old, he started his education at Public School 7 in Brooklyn. School was not easy for him. The teachers were strict, often using physical punishment to maintain discipline, and they showed little patience for the children of immigrants who struggled with English or questioned authority. Al was bright enough, showing early promise as a student, but he had a problem with rules he did not respect and authority he did not acknowledge. The tension between his natural intelligence and his rebellious nature would define much of his early life. The family moved when Al was 11, relocating to 38 Garfield Place in the Park Slope neighborhood. This area would become central to the Capone family's life in Brooklyn, with various family members living at different addresses on the same street over the years. The neighborhood was slightly better than the Navy Yard district, with tree-lined streets and brownstone buildings that suggested upward mobility. For Gabriel and Teresa, it represented progress, another step up the ladder of American success. But Al's path was already diverging from his parents' dreams. By the time he entered 6th grade, his troubles with authority had escalated. At 14 years old, he got into a confrontation with a female teacher. The exact details of what was said or done have been lost to history, but the result was clear. Al struck her. The school's principal responded by beating the boy, and Al was expelled. He never returned to formal education. His schooling ended that day, and with it, any conventional path to success closed behind him. What followed were years of drift and discovery. Al worked odd jobs around Brooklyn, trying to help support his family. He clerked in a candy store, set up pins in a bowling alley, worked in a bookbindery, and labored in an ammunition plant. These were honest jobs, the kind of work that might have led to a stable, unremarkable life. But the streets were calling to him, and on the streets there were other possibilities, other examples of success that had nothing to do with working in factories or behind shop counters. He joined the street gangs that were a fact of life in early 20th century Brooklyn. First came the Brooklyn Rippers, then the 40 Thieves Juniors, youth gangs that engaged in petty crime and vandalism. These were not yet serious criminal organizations, but rather loose associations of neighborhood kids who protected their territory, caused trouble, and occasionally broke the law. For a boy without education and with limited prospects, the gangs offered something that regular society did not: respect, belonging, and the promise of easy money. It was during this period that Al came to the attention of older, more established criminals. He joined the James Street Boys gang, which was run by a man named Johnny Torrio, a figure who would change the course of Al's life. Torrio was what they called a gentleman gangster, someone who combined criminal enterprise with a certain code of conduct, who preferred negotiation to violence when possible, and who saw crime not as random acts of theft, but as a business to be organized and managed. In Torrio, young Al Capone found more than a boss. He found a mentor. Through Torrio, Capone became associated with the 5 Points Gang, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Manhattan. But his most important connection came through another criminal operator, Francesco Ioele, better known as Frankie Yale. Yale owned a bar and dance hall in Coney Island called the Harvard Inn. The name was Yale's idea of a joke, giving his rough establishment a name that evoked the Ivy League. There was nothing academic about the Harvard Inn. It was a place where alcohol flowed, where prostitutes worked, where gambling took place, and where men with ambition could learn the underworld trade. Capone started at the Harvard Inn as a dishwasher, but his size, his toughness, and his willingness to use violence quickly earned him a promotion. He became a bouncer and a bartender, working the door and keeping order in an establishment that often teetered on the edge of chaos. He was good at the work. At 6 feet tall and powerfully built, he had a physical presence that could intimidate. But he also had a certain charm. an ability to talk to people and make them feel at ease, even as he was shaking them down or throwing them out. It was at the Harvard Inn that Al Capone received the wound that would mark him for life. The date was sometime in 1918. He was working the door when a man named Frank Galluccio came in with his sister Lena and his date, Maria Tazio. Al, 19 years old and full of himself, could not help but stare at Lena. He made a comment to her, something crude or forward, the exact words lost but the meaning clear. Frank demanded an apology. Al, drunk on youth and power, refused. Frank Galluccio pulled out a knife and slashed Al across the left side of his face. 3 cuts, deep and vicious, one across the cheek, one near the ear, one along the jaw. Blood poured down Al's face and onto his white shirt. The cuts would leave permanent scars, thick and raised, impossible to hide. For the rest of his life, Al Capone would be marked by those 3 slashes. Newspapers would later call him Scarface, a nickname he despised, a name that reminded him of a moment of humiliation, a reminder that he had been wounded and marked by another man. Some sources claim that less than 2 weeks after the fight, the man who cut Capone was found dead with a slit throat. Whether this was Capone's revenge or mere coincidence remains unclear. What is certain is that Frank Galluccio would later work as one of Capone's bodyguards, suggesting that either the incident was forgiven or that Capone preferred to keep potential enemies close. The world of the underworld operated by different rules than the world above. But 1918 brought more than scars. It brought love, or something like it. Al met May Josephine Coughlin, an Irish Catholic girl, and despite the social barriers that separated Italian and Irish communities, they fell for each other. May became pregnant, and on December 4, 1918, she gave birth to a son, Albert Francis Capone, whom they nicknamed Sonny. Less than a month later, on December 30, 1918, Al and May were married at St. Mary Star of the Sea Church on Court Street in the Carroll Gardens section of Brooklyn. Al was only 19, still technically a minor, and his parents had to give written consent for the marriage. By all accounts, Al and May had a genuine affection for each other, and by the standards of the time and place, theirs would be a lasting marriage. May knew what Al was, knew the life he led, and she accepted it, or at least learned to live with it. Sonny, their only child, would suffer from hearing loss in his left ear as a result of an illness in childhood, and Al would prove to be a devoted father, at least in his own way, always ensuring his family had the best of everything that money could buy. The end of 1918 found Al Capone at a crossroads. He was a young father, a new husband, a man with a scarred face and a reputation on the streets. He was working for Frankie Yale, learning the criminal trade, making connections with men like Johnny Torrio. The factory job that might have offered him a promotion, the conventional life that might have been his, was no longer even a possibility. He had chosen his path, or perhaps the path had chosen him. Punished, in 1919, opportunity knocked. Johnny Torrio, who had moved to Chicago years earlier, sent word. He needed help. He needed someone he could trust, someone tough, someone who understood the business. He was inviting Al Capone to come to Chicago to join him in building something bigger than anything they had seen in Brooklyn. The invitation would change everything. Part 2. Chicago Calls. Chicago in 1919 was a city transformed by war and on the brink of transformation by law. The Great War had just ended, and soldiers were returning home to a nation that seemed both familiar and strange. The city had grown explosively over the previous decades, becoming the second largest metropolis in America, a hub of industry, transportation, and commerce. The stockyards processed meat for the nation, the steel mills forged the tools of progress, and the railroads connected Chicago to every corner of the country. It was a city of broad shoulders and vast ambition, a place where fortunes could be made and lost in a single generation. But beneath the legitimate economy ran a shadow world of vice and crime.
Gambling houses operated openly, brothels flourished in designated districts, and saloons poured drinks for a population that loved to drink. James "Big Jim" Colosimo controlled much of this underworld, running a network of brothels, restaurants, and nightclubs that brought him wealth and influence. He was a first-generation success story in the criminal world, a man who had arrived in Chicago with nothing and built an empire through cunning and ruthlessness. Johnny Torrio had come to Chicago in 1909 at Colosimo's invitation. Torrio was Colosimo's nephew by marriage, and Big Jim needed someone he could trust to help manage and expand his operations. Torrio brought organization to chaos, applying business principles to criminal enterprises. He was a strategist, someone who thought several steps ahead, who preferred to outthink his opponents rather than outfight them. He saw opportunities where others saw only risk. When Torrio sent for Al Capone in 1919, he was calling in a favor and investing in the future. He needed someone to manage one of Colosimo's brothels, someone who could handle trouble, someone loyal. Al arrived in Chicago that year, leaving May and young Sonny behind in Brooklyn temporarily, stepping off the train into a city that would become forever associated with his name. Al's first job was as a bouncer in one of the brothels that Torrio managed for Colosimo. It was work he knew well from his days at the Harvard Inn. He kept order, collected money, dealt with difficult customers, and occasionally provided more violent services when persuasion failed. It was in one of these establishments that Al Capone likely contracted syphilis, the disease that would eventually kill him. The exact circumstances are lost to history, but the consequence would follow him for the rest of his life. At the time, syphilis was a shameful disease, one that men rarely admitted to having and often failed to treat. There were treatments available, including Salvarsan, which could cure the infection if administered early enough. But Al Capone, perhaps out of embarrassment, perhaps out of ignorance, never sought proper treatment. The infection would remain in his body, dormant at first, a time bomb slowly counting down. 1919 and 1920. The future seemed full of possibility. Al brought his family to Chicago, purchasing a two-story building at 7244 South Prairie Avenue in the Park Manor neighborhood for $5,500. It was a solid, middle-class house in a respectable area, the kind of place where his mother and father might have dreamed of living. May and Sonny joined him, and the Capones began to establish themselves in their new city. Meanwhile, something momentous was happening in America. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution took effect, and the United States officially became a dry nation. The Volstead Act, which provided the enforcement mechanism for the amendment, prohibited the production, sale, transportation, and possession of beverages containing more than 0.5% alcohol. The era of prohibition had begun. For most Americans, prohibition was an inconvenience or an outrage. For men like Johnny Torrio and Al Capone, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Overnight, a legal commodity that Americans consumed in vast quantities became illegal. The demand did not disappear, it simply went underground, and whoever could supply that demand stood to make an enormous fortune. Torrio saw this immediately. He urged Big Jim Colosimo to expand into bootlegging, to use their existing criminal infrastructure to capture this new market. But Colosimo refused. He was comfortable with his existing operations, content with the wealth he had already accumulated. He had recently married a young singer named Dale Winter, and he was enjoying his success, not looking to take new risks. His refusal to enter the bootlegging business signed his death warrant. On May 11, 1920, Colosimo was called to his own restaurant, Colosimo's Café, ostensibly for a delivery. When he arrived, a gunman was waiting in the cloakroom. A single shot to the head killed Big Jim Colosimo instantly. The killer was most likely Frankie Yale, brought in from New York specifically for the job, acting on orders from Johnny Torrio. Al Capone, though suspected by some, was probably not directly involved, but he certainly knew what was happening. This was a lesson in the brutal economics of the underworld. Those who would not adapt would be removed. Torrio, with Colosimo out of the way, inherited the entire organization. At the age of 38, he was now the most powerful criminal in Chicago, and at his right hand stood 21-year-old Al Capone. Torrio immediately began building the bootlegging empire that Colosimo had refused to create. He formed partnerships with legitimate brewers like Joseph Stenson, who could produce the beer that speakeasies would sell. He organized territories throughout the city, dividing Chicago into zones where different gangs could operate without interfering with each other. He brought in criminals from New York, expanding his organization with experienced operators who understood the business. And he promoted Al Capone, giving him greater responsibility, trusting him with important operations. Capone proved himself quickly. He was assigned to manage the Four Deuces, a building at 2222 South Wabash Avenue that served as headquarters for Torrio's empire. The Four Deuces was a 4-story building that housed a saloon on the first floor, a gambling operation on the second, a brothel on the third and fourth floors, and Torrio's offices throughout. It was a one-stop shop for vice, and Capone ran it efficiently, ensuring that money flowed upward and trouble was kept to a minimum. But Chicago was not a city that would remain peaceful for long. Other gangs saw the same opportunities that Torrio saw, and they wanted their share of the bootlegging profits. The city's criminal landscape was a complex patchwork of ethnic gangs: Irish on the north side, Italians on the south side, Polish and Jewish gangs scattered throughout. Each group had its own leaders, its own territories, its own ambitions. Torrio's instinct was to negotiate, to create a citywide cartel where everyone could profit without constant warfare. In 1920, he brokered an agreement between most of Chicago's bootlegging gangs, dividing the city into territories and establishing rules for how business would be conducted. It was an ambitious attempt to bring order to chaos, and for a while, it worked. The beer flowed, the speakeasies prospered, and the money poured in. Torrio's organization was soon making millions of dollars per year. Pregnant. But not everyone was willing to play by Torrio's rules. The Jenner brothers, Sicilian immigrants who ran operations on the west side, bristled at restrictions. They wanted to expand, to take over territory that Torrio had allocated to others. And on the north side, a charismatic Irish gangster named Dean O'Banion controlled the bootlegging trade north of the Chicago River. O'Banion was everything Torrio was not: flamboyant, violent, unpredictable, and unwilling to be part of anyone's organization unless he was in charge. The stage was Chicago synonymous with gangster violence, a war that would make Al Capone the most famous criminal in America. A war that would leave hundreds dead and transform the city into a battleground. But in the early 1920s, as Capone learned the business under Torrio's patient instruction, the worst of the violence was still ahead. Al Capone was rising. He was making money, earning respect, building connections. He moved easily between the world of crime and the world of legitimate business, developing relationships with politicians, police officers, and businessmen who were all too happy to accept his bribes and look the other way. He was learning from Torrio not just how to run criminal operations, but how to think strategically, how to plan for the long term, how to build an empire that could last. In 1923, the first serious challenge to that empire emerged when William Dever was elected mayor of Chicago. Unlike his predecessor, corrupt and cooperative William Hale Thompson, Dever actually intended to enforce prohibition laws and crack down on vice. Suddenly, operating openly in downtown Chicago became dangerous. Torrio needed a new base of operations, somewhere he could control completely, where local politicians would be friendly and local police would cooperate. He found it in Cicero, a suburb just west of Chicago. Torrio ordered Capone to take over Cicero and Capone carried out the assignment with ruthless efficiency. The town's officials were bribed, threatened, or both. On April 1, 1924, during the Cicero municipal elections, Capone's men terrorized voters and opposition candidates, ensuring that the right people won. The Chicago Police Department had to send plainclothes officers to stop the violence. In the chaos of that election day, Al's brother, Frank Capone, was killed in a shootout with police. It was Al's first experience with the cost of the life they had chosen, the first time the violence touched his own family directly. Bertberg, but Cicero was secured. Torrio and Capone established dozens of speakeasies, gambling houses, and brothels throughout the town. They operated with virtual immunity, having effectively made Cicero a company town, where their organization was the company. The profits soared, and Al Capone's reputation grew. He was no longer just Torrio's lieutenant. He was becoming a power in his own right. Then came the event that would change everything. On November 8, 1924, Mike Merlo died. Merlo was the head of the Unione Siciliana, a fraternal organization that also served as a mediating body between Italian criminal gangs. Merlo had kept peace between Torrio and the North Side gang led by O'Banion, preventing the violence from spiraling out of control. With Merlo dead, that restraint died with him. 2 days after Merlo's death, on November 10th, 3 men walked into Schofield's Flowers, a flower shop on North State Street, owned by Dean O'Banion. They were ostensibly there to buy flowers for Merlo's funeral. O'Banion greeted them personally, shaking hands with the first man, while the other 2 drew guns and shot him dead. The killers were likely Frankie Yale, John Scalise, and Albert Anselmi, acting on behalf of Torrio and Capone. Hockey is meant to eliminate a problem. Instead, it started a war. The North Side gang, now led by Jaime Weiss and backed by George Bugs Moran, vowed revenge. They would hunt Torrio and Capone relentlessly, and Chicago would run red with blood.
Part 3. The Beer Wars.
The assassination of Dean O'Banion shattered whatever fragile peace had existed between Chicago's rival gangs. What followed would come to be known as the Beer Wars, a 5-year period of violence that transformed Chicago into a killing ground and made Al Capone's name synonymous with gangster brutality. The numbers tell part of the story. From 1922 to 1926, mobsters killed 315 of their own, and police killed another 160 gangsters. But statistics cannot capture the atmosphere of fear and chaos that gripped the city, where gang members drove through streets spraying bullets, where bombs destroyed businesses that refused to cooperate, where death could come suddenly and without warning. Mose, who took control of the North Side gang after O'Banion's murder, was consumed by the need for vengeance. He was methodical in his hatred, planning attacks that were designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. In January 1925, only 2 months after O'Banion's death, Weiss struck. Al Capone was ambushed as his car drove through the streets of Chicago. Bullets shattered the windows and tore through the bodywork, but Capone escaped without injury, shaken but alive. It was a warning of what was to come. On January 24, 1925, Weiss and Bugs Moran made their boldest attempt yet. Johnny Torrio had spent the afternoon shopping with his wife. As they returned to their apartment building at 7011 Clyde Avenue on the south side, a black Cadillac pulled up. Men jumped out with shotguns and pistols. They shot Torrio multiple times, the shotgun blasts tearing into his jaw, chest, and abdomen. He fell to the sidewalk, bleeding profusely, his wife screaming. The attackers stood over him, and one pointed a gun at Torrio's head to deliver the final shot. The gun jammed. Police sirens wailed in the distance, and the killers fled. Johnny Torrio survived, but barely. He was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons worked for hours to save his life. His jaw was shattered, his body riddled with pellets and bullets, but he clung to life. When Assistant State's Attorney John Sparbaro visited him in the hospital, and asked who had shot him, Torrio remained true to the underworld code. He refused to talk. Even facing death, he would not become an informer. But something fundamental had changed in Johnny Torrio. Lying in that hospital bed, feeling the pain from his wounds, he made a decision. The life of constant violence, the endless war with rivals who would never stop trying to kill him, no longer held any appeal. He had made his fortune, millions of dollars hidden away in safe investments. He was 43 years old, and if he continued on this path, he would surely die violently in some Chicago street. The reward no longer justified the risk. There was also the matter of a bootlegging conviction that Torrio had incurred in a setup by O'Banion before his death. He was sentenced to 9 months in the Lake County Jail in Waukegan. While he served that time, protected from his enemies by prison walls, Torrio made his final decisions. When he was released in late 1925, he called Al Capone to a meeting and spoke words that would echo through Chicago's underworld. "It's all yours, Al. Me? I'm quitting. It's Europe for me." And with that, he handed his entire criminal empire to his 26-year-old protégé. Everything: the breweries, the speakeasies, the gambling operations, the brothels, the political connections, the armies of enforcers, all of it. The organization that grossed about $70 million a year now belonged to Al Capone. It was an astonishing transfer of power, made all the more remarkable by Torrio's survival. He would live another 32 years, dying peacefully in 1957, one of the only major gangsters of the Prohibition era to die of natural causes. For Al Capone, the weight of leadership fell heavily on young shoulders. At 26, he was now responsible for one of the largest criminal organizations in America. He had hundreds of men working for him, millions of dollars flowing through his operations, and powerful enemies who wanted him dead. The North Side gang still sought revenge for O'Banion, and they now saw Capone as the prime target. Other rivals sensed opportunity in the leadership transition and considered whether this young Italian could really hold together the empire that Torrio had built. Capone's response to these challenges was to consolidate his power through a combination of strategic violence and ruthless efficiency. He expanded his organization's territories, moving into areas that had been controlled by smaller gangs and forcing them to either join him or face destruction. He invested in legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for his illegal operations, purchasing cleaning and dyeing companies, restaurants, and real estate. He cultivated relationships with politicians at every level of government, from aldermen to judges to congressmen, distributing money and favors with a generous hand. But most importantly, Capone used violence to establish dominance. Rivals who refused to cooperate were eliminated. Witnesses who might testify were intimidated or killed. Police officers who could not be bribed were isolated and transferred. Capone built a reputation for brutality that made people think twice before crossing him. Stories circulated about his rages, about men who had offended him and disappeared, about the baseball bat he allegedly kept in his office for dealing with traitors. One particularly brutal incident illustrated Capone's willingness to use violence to maintain control. 3 of his gunmen, John Scalise, Albert Anselmi, and Joseph Junta, were suspected of plotting to overthrow him. Capone invited them to a banquet, treating them as honored guests, plying them with food and wine. As the evening progressed, Capone stood and gave a speech praising their loyalty and service. Then, in front of the assembled guests, he produced an Indian club and beat all 3 men to death. It was a message to anyone else who might consider betrayal. Capone would not just kill traitors, he would do it personally and publicly. The war with the North Side gang continued unabated. In September 1926, Jaime Weiss led an assault on the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero, Capone's headquarters. A convoy of cars drove past the hotel, and gunmen opened fire with machine guns, spraying the building with over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Capone was inside, protected by bodyguards, and emerged unscathed but furious. The attack had been an embarrassment, a demonstration that even in his own stronghold, he was not safe. Clangone's response came swiftly. On October 11th, 1926, Jaime Weiss was shot to death outside Holy Name Cathedral on the north side. The gunman used machine guns, firing from a second-floor apartment across the street, cutting Weiss down as he walked toward the church. With Weiss dead, the leadership of the North Side gang passed to George "Bugs" Moran, a man who hated Capone with an intensity that bordered on obsession. By 1927, Al Capone had achieved a level of power and wealth that was extraordinary even by the standards of the criminal underworld. Estimates placed his income at close to $100 million per year, an astronomical sum equivalent to roughly $1.4 billion in today's money. He controlled not just Chicago, but had extended his reach into surrounding states, with operations in Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, Wisconsin, and beyond. He owned politicians, judges, and police officials. He had an army of several hundred enforcers at his command. At the age of 28, he was arguably the most powerful criminal in America. But power brought problems. The more successful Capone became, the more attention he attracted. The murders, the bombings, the open corruption, all of it was creating a backlash. Newspapers ran stories about Chicago as a lawless city controlled by gangsters. Reform groups demanded action. The federal government began to take notice. And Capone's enemies, particularly Bugs Moran, continued plotting his death. Through all of this, Capone maintained a public persona that was carefully crafted to win sympathy. He presented himself as a businessman, famously saying, "I am just a businessman, giving the people what they want." He opened soup kitchens during the early years of the Depression, feeding thousands of hungry Chicagoans. He made donations to Catholic charities, including sending $15,600 to his local church. He paid for programs to fight rickets, a childhood disease caused by malnutrition, ensuring that Chicago's schoolchildren received daily milk rations. When he attended baseball games at Wrigley Field or Comiskey Park, crowds cheered for him, treating him like a celebrity. Capone cultivated the image of the Robin Hood gangster, a man who took from the corrupt and gave to the poor. It was brilliant. Public relations, and many Chicagoans bought into it. During Prohibition, when millions of Americans were breaking the law by drinking illegal alcohol, it was easy to see bootleggers not as criminals, but as entrepreneurs, providing a service that people wanted. Capone understood this and exploited it ruthlessly. Blazing the charitable gestures and the public smiles was a man who had ordered dozens of murders, who ran operations that destroyed lives through gambling addiction and prostitution, who corrupted entire government institutions. The myth and the reality were very different things, and as the 1920s drew to a close, the gap between what Capone appeared to be and what he actually was would become impossible to ignore. The event that would crystallize public opinion and begin Capone's downfall was approaching. It would happen on a cold February morning in 1929, in a garage on North Clark Street, and it would shock the nation. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre would mark the beginning of the end for Al Capone's reign as Chicago's crime king. Part 4. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. February 14, 1929, began as a typical winter day in Chicago. The temperature hovered in the high teens, and a light snow fell across the city, dusting the streets and sidewalks with white. Most Chicagoans were preparing for Valentine's Day celebrations, shopping for flowers and chocolates, planning romantic dinners. In the criminal underworld, however, a different kind of planning was underway. Planning that would result in one of the most notorious murders in American history. The SMC Cartage Company was located at 2122 North Clark Street, in the Lincoln Park neighborhood on Chicago's North Side. It was ostensibly a legitimate garage for car storage and repair, but in reality, it served as a front for the North Side gang's bootlegging operations. The building itself was unremarkable, a one-story brick structure with large doors opening onto the street, the kind of place that most Chicagoans walked past without a second glance. On that Valentine's Day morning, 7 men gathered inside the garage. 6 of them were members or associates of George Bugs Moran's North Side gang. There was Peter Gusenberg and his brother Frank, both experienced gunmen who had carried out multiple hits for the organization. Adam Heyer served as the gang's accountant and business manager. Albert Weinshank was a speakeasy operator and liquor distributor. Reinhard Schwimmer was an optometrist who loved associating with gangsters and had become friendly with Moran's crew. James Clark was another gang member and enforcer. The 7th man, John May, was a garage mechanic who had some connections to the gang and was working on a truck that morning. The men were waiting for Bugs Moran himself, who was expected to arrive at any moment. Some accounts suggest they were waiting for a delivery of hijacked whiskey, a shipment from the Purple Gang in Detroit that would bring significant profit. Other historians dispute this, noting that the men were dressed in expensive suits rather than work clothes, suggesting they were there for a meeting rather than to unload trucks. Whatever the reason for their gathering, they waited together in the cold garage, probably talking, smoking, checking their watches, wondering when their boss would arrive. Bugs Moran was running late that morning. As he approached the garage with 2 of his men, he noticed a car that looked like a police vehicle parked outside. Moran, who had narrowly avoided arrest many times, had developed an instinct for danger. Something about the scene made him uneasy. He made a decision that would save his life. He turned around and left. He would later tell reporters, "I guess I missed death by minutes." At approximately 10:30 in the morning, 4 men entered the garage through the front door. 2 of them were dressed in police uniforms, complete with long winter coats and official-looking caps. The others wore civilian clothing. To the 7 men inside the garage, it appeared to be a police raid, an unfortunately common occurrence in Prohibition-era Chicago. Such raids were usually resolved with bribes or connections, and the men probably expected to be taken to the police station, held for a few hours, and then released after the appropriate payments were made. The men in uniform ordered the 7 to line up facing the north wall of the garage. The victims complied, probably annoyed but not particularly frightened. They stood with their backs to their captors, hands against the wall or at their sides. They were utterly unprepared for what happened next. The attackers opened fire with Thompson submachine guns, weapons that had earned the nickname Chicago typewriters, for the rapid, chattering sound they made when firing. The garage erupted in noise and chaos. 70 rounds were fired from the Thompson guns, along with several blasts from a shotgun. The bullets tore through the 7 men, cutting them down where they stood, blood spraying across the brick wall, bodies crumpling to the cold concrete floor. The shooting lasted perhaps 90 seconds, though to anyone listening nearby, it must have seemed both shorter and longer, a compressed eternity of violence. When the guns finally fell silent, 6 of the 7 men were already dead. Frank Gusenberg, shot multiple times, still clung to life. He had been hit 14 times, but somehow remained conscious as blood pooled beneath him. The killers did not leave immediately. In a brilliant piece of deception, the 2 men in civilian clothes came out of the garage first, walking with their hands up as if they were being arrested. The 2 men in police uniforms followed, guns drawn, playing the role of arresting officers. Any witness watching from a distance would have seen what appeared to be police officers making an arrest after a shooting, not a massacre carried out by criminals dressed as police. The 4 men climbed into their car and drove away into the snowy morning, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would shock the nation. Neighbors who had heard the gunfire called the real police. Officers from the Chicago Police Department's 36th District arrived within minutes to find a scene of horror. 6 bodies lay sprawled on the garage floor in pools of blood, the brick wall behind them pocked with bullet holes and streaked with gore. And Frank Gusenberg, somehow still alive, barely breathing, his body riddled with bullets. The police officers tried desperately to get information from Gusenberg before he died. They asked him who had shot him, who was responsible, begging him to give them something they could use to catch the killers. Gusenberg, true to the code of the underworld, refused to cooperate. "Nobody shot me," he whispered through blood-filled lungs. He died 3 hours later in the hospital, taking whatever he knew to the grave. The news of the St. Valentine's Day massacre spread across Chicago within hours and across the nation by the next day. Newspapers ran graphic photographs of the bodies, images that shocked readers accustomed to gang violence but unprepared for carnage on this scale. 7 men murdered in broad daylight in what appeared to be a carefully planned execution. The death toll from a single incident was unprecedented. Gang wars had produced plenty of murders, but typically 1 or 2 victims at a time. This was something different, something that spoke to a level of organization and brutality that frightened even hardened Chicagoans. Suspicion immediately fell on Al Capone. The massacre bore all the hallmarks of his organization: careful planning, ruthless execution, and the targeting of Bugs Moran and his gang. When reporters reached Capone in Florida, where he had made sure to establish an alibi, they asked him about the murders. Capone responded with practiced innocence. "The only man who kills like that is Bugs Moran." When reporters reached Moran, who had escaped death by minutes, he gave them a quote that would echo through history. "Only Capone kills like that." Gravitational, the public certainty that Capone was behind the massacre, proving it was impossible. No one who witnessed the killings was willing to talk. The weapons used in the attack were eventually found, but could not be conclusively linked to Capone's organization. The identities of the shooters remained uncertain, though later confessions and investigations suggested they included Fred Burke, Gus Winkler, Fred Gertz, and other gunmen from the Egan's Rats gang in St. Louis, acting on behalf of Capone. One theory held that Capone's enforcer, Jack McGurn, had planned and coordinated the attack, but theory and suspicion were not evidence. The massacre achieved its tactical objective. The North Side gang was crippled. The loss of 6 key members, including some of their best gunmen and their accountant, devastated the organization. Bugs Moran survived, but his power was broken. The North Side gang would never again be a serious threat to Capone's dominance of Chicago. From a purely criminal perspective, the massacre was a success. But from every other perspective, it was a disaster for Capone. The public revulsion at the murders was immediate and widespread. The image of 7 men lined up against a wall and machine-gunned to death was too much, even for a city that had grown accustomed to gang violence. The massacre made it impossible to see gangsters as romantic Robin Hood figures. They were killers, pure and simple, and the public's tolerance for their activities began to evaporate. Perhaps more importantly, the massacre attracted federal attention. President Herbert Hoover, newly inaugurated in 1929, made fighting organized crime a priority of his administration. At a conference of gang leaders in Atlantic City in May 1929, just 3 months after the massacre, other mobsters pressured Capone to lower his profile. The heat he had brought down on Chicago was affecting everyone's business. Message was clear. Capone had become too famous, too notorious, too much of a target. The federal government began building cases against Capone. The Bureau of Investigation, predecessor to the FBI, started looking into his activities. The Treasury Department assigned its best agents to investigate his finances. A young federal agent named Elliot Ness was given a team of incorruptible officers, dubbed the Untouchables, because they could not be bribed, with orders to harass Capone's bootlegging operations and gather evidence for prosecution. In March 1929, Capone had been subpoenaed to appear before a federal grand jury in Chicago. He claimed to be too ill to travel, submitting a doctor's note stating he was suffering from bronchial pneumonia. Federal agents investigated and discovered that Capone had actually been attending horse races in Miami, taking boat trips to the Bahamas, and appearing in perfect health. When Capone finally did appear before the grand jury and completed his testimony on March 27th, he was arrested for contempt of court as he left the building. He posted bond and was released, but the federal government had sent a message. They were coming for him. Clang the walls were closing in. In May 1929, only 3 months after the massacre, Capone was arrested in Philadelphia on weapons charges. He and his bodyguard were each sentenced to 1 year in prison, and Capone served 9 months before being released in March 1930. It was a minor charge, but it demonstrated that Capone was no longer untouchable. The St. Valentine's Day massacre marked a turning point. Before February 14, 1929, Al Capone was seen by many as a colorful character, a successful businessman who happened to operate outside the law. After that date, he was public enemy number 1, a man whose organization had committed murder on a scale that could not be tolerated. The massacre that was meant to eliminate his rivals had instead started the process that would eliminate him. Part 5. The Government's Case. While Eliot Ness and his untouchables received much of the publicity for bringing down Al Capone, it was actually a quieter, less glamorous investigation that would prove decisive. The man primarily responsible for Capone's eventual conviction was not a gun-toting federal agent, but an accountant named Frank Wilson. Wilson worked for the Internal Revenue Service's Special Intelligence Unit, a group of investigators who specialized in using tax law to prosecute criminals who seemed immune to conventional law enforcement. The strategy was brilliantly simple. Al Capone lived like a millionaire, spending lavishly on clothes, cars, homes, and entertainment. He made no secret of his wealth, practically flaunting it in public. Yet he had never filed an income tax return. He claimed to have no income, to own no property in his own name, to be merely an employee of a furniture company. The gap between his lifestyle and his claimed income was vast and obvious. The challenge was proving it in court. Frank Wilson began his investigation in 1929, working methodically through Capone's finances. It was painstaking work, tracking down records, interviewing witnesses, following the money through layers of deception. Capone had been careful in many ways, never maintaining bank accounts in his own name, never endorsing checks, always dealing in cash. But his very extravagance created a trail. Wilson documented purchases that totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars, custom-made suits costing thousands of dollars each, furniture for his Palm Island estate in Florida, his telephone bills, his property improvements. All of these expenses suggested an income far greater than Capone admitted to having. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In an attempt to settle his tax problems and avoid prosecution, Capone had his lawyer negotiate with the government. The lawyer, trying to reach a settlement, made admissions about Capone's income for certain years, offering to pay taxes on amounts that had never been reported. These admissions, made in an effort to resolve the matter, became crucial evidence. Capone's own lawyer had essentially provided the government with proof of unreported income. In March 1931, a secret grand jury indicted Capone on charges of income tax evasion for 1924. Additional indictments followed in June 1931, charging Capone with 22 counts of tax evasion for the years 1925 through 1929. The government also indicted him for conspiracy to violate the Volstead Act, citing 5,000 specific violations of prohibition laws. If convicted on all counts, Capone faced a maximum sentence of 34 years in prison. Capone's lawyers, recognizing the strength of the government's case, attempted to negotiate a plea bargain. They reached an agreement with U.S. Attorney George Johnson. Capone would plead guilty in exchange for a sentence of 2.5 years. With good behavior, he would likely serve even less time. It seemed like a reasonable deal for both sides. The government would get a conviction and remove Capone from Chicago. while Capone would serve a relatively short sentence and emerge with his organization intact. But Judge James Herbert Wilkerson, who would preside over the case, had other ideas. When Capone appeared in court expecting the plea bargain to be formalized, Wilkerson shocked everyone by announcing that he was not bound by any deal between prosecutors and defense attorneys. The judge made it clear that he would impose whatever sentence he deemed appropriate, regardless of what had been negotiated. Capone's lawyers immediately changed his plea to not guilty, and the case went to trial. The trial began on October 6, 1931, in the Federal Building in Chicago. It immediately became a media circus, with reporters from across the country covering every development. The courtroom was packed with spectators, hoping to catch a glimpse of the nation's most famous gangster. Capone attended every session, dressed impeccably in custom suits, appearing confident and unconcerned. But the government's case was stronger than Capone's lawyers had anticipated. Prosecutor George Johnson systematically presented evidence of Capone's lavish spending. Witnesses testified about the money Capone spent on furniture, on his Palm Island estate, on parties and entertainment. His telephone bill alone in 1929 had been over $3,000, equivalent to more than $50,000 in today's money. He had spent $40,000 to purchase the Palm Island property, and another $100,000 on improvements, including a swimming pool that cost $4,000. His expenditures on suits were staggering, $6,180 in a single year. He had thrown parties that cost thousands of dollars, including a $3,160 Columbus Day celebration and a $4,925 Kentucky Derby party. Who worked in Capone's gambling operations, who could testify about the vast sums of money flowing through his illegal businesses. They showed that Capone had donated $58,000 to a police and widows fund in a single year, more money than most people earned in a decade of honest work. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Al Capone was living like a millionaire, spending money he had never reported as income. Discharged, the defense attempted to counter by claiming that Capone had lost all his money gambling. A series of witnesses testified that Capone was an extraordinarily unlucky gambler, losing tens of thousands of dollars on horse races year after year. According to defense witnesses, Capone had lost more than $217,000 on horse racing from 1924 to 1927. Not one witness could name a single time Capone had won a bet. The journalist Damon Runyon, covering the trial, quipped that he would award Al Capone the title of world's worst horse player. But the defense strategy had a fatal flaw. Even if Capone had lost money gambling, gambling losses could only be deducted from gambling winnings, not from other income. And the prosecution had proven that Capone had vast income from bootlegging, gambling operations, and prostitution. His claimed gambling losses were irrelevant to the question of whether he had paid taxes on his actual income. Judge Wilkerson allowed the prosecution to present evidence of Capone's spending at great length, building a picture of a man who lived in luxury while claiming to have no income. The defense, by contrast, seemed to have no effective response. Their case was weak, their witnesses unconvincing, their argument fundamentally flawed. On October 17, 1931, after deliberating for several hours, the jury returned its verdict. Capone was found guilty on 3 counts of felony tax evasion and 2 counts of misdemeanor failure to file tax returns. He was found not guilty on 18 of the 23 charges, but the 5 convictions were more than sufficient to send him to prison. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Capone showed little emotion, but those who knew him said they saw something change in his face, a realization that the life he had known was over. His lawyers immediately began planning an appeal, but everyone understood that the verdict would likely stand. Al Capone, who had avoided prosecution for murder, bootlegging, and countless other crimes, had been brought down by the most mundane of charges: failure to pay his taxes. On October 24, 1931, Judge Wilkerson pronounced sentence. Capone was given 5 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine on the first felony count. The second felony conviction ran concurrently, meaning no additional time. Then Wilkerson dropped his bombshell. The third felony conviction would run consecutively, adding another 5 years. Combined with the misdemeanor sentences, Capone faced 11 years in federal prison, plus fines of $50,000 and court costs of $7,692. He was also liable for $215,000 in back taxes plus interest. Tightened. It was one of the harshest sentences ever imposed for tax evasion at that time. Capone had expected, at worst, a few years in a comfortable federal prison where he could continue to run his organization through intermediaries. Instead, he faced more than a decade behind bars, stripped of his power, cut off from his empire. The 6-month contempt of court sentence from his earlier failure to appear before the grand jury would be served concurrently, adding nothing to his total time, but serving as a reminder of how the legal system had finally caught up with him. Capone was taken to the Cook County Jail to await transfer to federal prison. His lawyers filed appeals, arguing various technical points about the statute of limitations and the admissibility of evidence. But the appeals failed. The Supreme Court had already ruled that illegally earned income was subject to taxation. There was no legal escape from what the government had proven. On May 4, 1932, Al Capone entered the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, to begin serving his sentence. He was 33 years old. The King of Chicago had fallen, but his ordeal was only beginning. The prisons where he would spend the next 7.5 years would destroy him in ways that no rival gangster ever could. Part 6. Alcatraz and the Ravages of Disease. Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in 1932 was not the kind of prison designed to hold men like Al Capone. It was a large, relatively open facility where inmates with money and connections could sometimes buy comfort, where powerful prisoners could establish hierarchies and maintain influence. Capone, even behind bars, was still Al Capone. He had resources, he had loyal men on the outside, and he had a reputation that made even guards treat him with a certain deference. Within months, disturbing reports began reaching federal authorities. Capone had been given a relatively comfortable job in the prison. He had access to the warden, who met with him regularly. Guards were accepting bribes, bringing him food from outside, carrying messages to his organization in Chicago. He maintained a cash reserve hidden in his cell, which he used to tip guards and buy favors. Visitors came and went with unusual frequency. In many ways, Capone was recreating inside Atlanta the same system of corruption he had built in Chicago. The federal government, having gone to great lengths to convict and imprison Capone, was not about to let him continue running his criminal empire from a prison cell. A decision was made at the highest levels. Capone needed to be moved to a facility where his money and influence would mean nothing, where he could not intimidate or bribe his way to special treatment, where he would be just another prisoner, stripped of everything that had made him powerful. That facility was Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, located on a rock island in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz had opened in 1934 as a maximum security prison designed specifically for the nation's most dangerous and incorrigible criminals. The facility was escape-proof, isolated by cold waters and strong currents. The rules were strict, the discipline harsh, the conditions deliberately austere. No prisoner would receive special privileges, no one could manipulate the system. It was intended to be the end of the line for criminals who had proven impossible to control in other prisons. Camouflage, 1934, without any advance notice, Al Capone was placed on a secure prison railroad car along with 52 other inmates and transported to California. The journey itself was shrouded in secrecy, with authorities going to great lengths to prevent any rescue attempts. When the train arrived, and the prisoners were transferred to boats for the trip across the bay to Alcatraz, Capone got his first glimpse of what would be his home for the next 4.5 years. A forbidding fortress of concrete and steel rising from the waters of the bay, a place of echoing cell blocks and perpetual fog. Warden James Johnston, who ran Alcatraz with an iron hand, later wrote about meeting Capone when the prisoners first arrived. Johnston participated in the orientation of new inmates, and he easily recognized Capone in the lineup. Capone was grinning, making smug comments to other prisoners, still playing the role of the big shot. Johnston made it his mission to break that attitude. Capone was assigned to cell number 85, a tiny space measuring approximately 5 feet by 9 feet, containing a cot, a fold-down desk, a chair, a toilet, and a sink. There was no privacy, no comfort, no amenities beyond the absolute minimum. His expensive suits were replaced with prison uniforms. His custom-made shirts and silk ties became museum pieces. He was given a prison job, first working in the laundry and later in the basement, menial labor designed to occupy time and break spirit. RAs were simple and strictly enforced. No talking except during designated times, no newspapers, no radio, limited mail privileges. Visitors were rare and heavily supervised. Every aspect of life was regimented and controlled. For a man who had been accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed instantly, who had commanded armies of men and controlled the destiny of a city, the adjustment was crushing. Capone tried to assert himself in small ways. He attempted to establish himself as a leader among the prisoners, using his reputation and personality to build alliances. But Alcatraz was different from other prisons. Many of the inmates were themselves notorious criminals, men who had no reason to defer to Capone. More importantly, the guards were vigilant against any prisoner gaining influence over others. Any attempt by Capone to recreate his old hierarchies was immediately shut down. Spherical and powerlessness took their toll. Capone got into a fight with another inmate in the recreation yard and was placed in solitary confinement for 8 days. While working in the basement, another prisoner stabbed him with a pair of barbering shears during an argument. Capone was taken to the prison hospital, treated for a minor wound, and released. The incident was a stark reminder that he was no longer protected by bodyguards, that here he was vulnerable like anyone else. But a far more dangerous enemy than rival inmates was attacking Capone from within. The syphilis infection he had contracted as a young man, never properly treated, had been progressing silently through his body for more than 15 years. The disease moves through stages. The initial chancre heals, and the infected person enters a secondary stage, marked by rashes and flu-like symptoms. Then comes a latent period, where the disease appears to be gone, where the infected person feels fine and shows no symptoms. But the bacteria remain, burrowing into organs, particularly the heart and brain. By the mid-1930s, Capone's syphilis had entered its tertiary stage, attacking his central nervous system, causing neurosyphilis. The symptoms began subtly at first. Capone experienced mood swings, becoming angry without provocation, then withdrawn and depressed. He had trouble concentrating, found himself forgetting things. His behavior became erratic. Guards noticed that he seemed confused at times, disoriented, responding to questions slowly or inappropriately. As the months passed, the deterioration accelerated. Capone's mental capacity diminished noticeably. He shuffled when he walked, developing a limping gait as the disease affected his coordination. Sores appeared on his face. His speech became slurred and difficult to understand. He spent more and more time in the prison hospital, unable to perform even simple tasks. The other prisoners, who had initially treated him with a mixture of respect and wariness, now pitied him or avoided him entirely. In February 1938, prison doctors formally diagnosed Capone with syphilis of the brain. They estimated that the disease had progressed to the point where it had caused permanent, irreversible damage. His cognitive abilities had been reduced to those of a young child. He was declared mentally unfit to remain in the general prison population and was moved permanently to the hospital wing, where he spent his final year on Alcatraz in a haze of confusion and pain. PNG, Capone, who had stood by her husband through everything, visited him when she could and was horrified by what she saw. The strong, confident man she had married was disappearing, replaced by someone who sometimes did not recognize her, who cried like a child, who asked confused questions about things that had happened years ago or had never happened at all. She petitioned the warden for his early release on humanitarian grounds, arguing that her husband posed no threat to anyone in his condition and that he needed medical care that the prison could not provide. The federal authorities, recognizing that keeping Capone imprisoned served no purpose beyond simple punishment and that he was unlikely to ever recover, agreed to release him. On January 6, 1939, Al Capone was transferred from Alcatraz to Terminal Island Prison in Los Angeles to serve out the remainder of his sentence for the misdemeanor charges. On November 16, 1939, after serving 7 years, 6 months, and 15 days of his 11-year sentence, Al Capone was released from federal custody. He was 40 years old. He had entered prison as the most powerful gangster in America, a man whose name was known across the world. He emerged as an invalid, his mind ravaged by disease, unable to care for himself, dependent on others for basic needs. The government had not just imprisoned Al Capone. Through a combination of deliberate policy and the natural progression of an untreated disease, they had destroyed him. Part 7. The Final Years. When Al Capone was released from prison in November 1939, the first stop was supposed to be Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, one of the finest medical facilities in the country. May Capone and family members had arranged for him to receive the best possible treatment for his neurosyphilis, hoping that doctors might be able to reverse, or at least arrest, the damage to his brain. But when the hospital administration learned that the patient seeking treatment was the notorious Al Capone, they refused to admit him. Even as a broken, sick man, his reputation preceded him. The family found an alternative at Union Memorial Hospital in Baltimore, where doctors were more willing to treat a patient based on medical need rather than moral judgment. Capone underwent several weeks of treatment as both an inpatient and outpatient. The medical care included attempts to combat the syphilis infection itself and treatments to manage the neurological symptoms. Capone was grateful for the compassionate treatment he received, and in a gesture that revealed the man he might have been in different circumstances, he donated 2 Japanese weeping cherry trees to the hospital, a gift that still blooms every spring. But the doctors at Union Memorial could only do so much. By 1939, a new drug called penicillin was being developed that would revolutionize the treatment of bacterial infections, including syphilis. When mass production of penicillin began in 1942, Capone was one of the first American civilians to receive the treatment. But it was too late. Penicillin could kill the bacteria causing the infection, but it could not repair the damage already done to his brain. The neural pathways that had been destroyed, the cognitive functions that had been lost, these could not be restored. The best the drug could do was prevent further deterioration. In March 1940, Capone left Baltimore and traveled to his mansion on Palm Island in Miami, Florida. He had purchased the property at 93 Palm Avenue in 1928, during the height of his power, for $40,000. He had spent another $100,000 improving the estate, adding docks, a boathouse, an extra garage, and a swimming pool. The 7-bedroom house sat on waterfront property, surrounded by palm trees and lush tropical vegetation, a private paradise where Capone had once entertained guests and conducted business meetings. Now it would become his prison. A comfortable one, but a prison nonetheless. The man who returned to Palm Island bore little resemblance to the Al Capone who had left Chicago in 1931. He was only 40 years old, but he moved like an elderly man, shuffling slowly, needing support to walk. His speech was difficult to understand, his words slurred and confused. He spent most of his time in simple activities, sitting in the sun, fishing off his dock, playing cards with family members when his concentration allowed it. May and other family members cared for him constantly, treating him like a great child, helping him dress, making sure he ate, keeping him safe from himself. Capone's mental state fluctuated. Sometimes he seemed almost lucid, recognizing family members and able to hold brief conversations about the past. Other times he was lost in confusion, asking about people who were dead, talking about events that had never happened, unable to remember what year it was or where he was. Doctors estimated that his cognitive abilities had degraded to those of a 12-year-old child, though this assessment was generous. There were days when he seemed to have even less awareness than that. The federal government maintained surveillance on the Palm Island estate for a time, concerned that Capone might somehow still be involved in criminal activities or that other gangsters might visit him, seeking his blessing for their operations. But it quickly became clear that such concerns were groundless. The crime boss, who had once commanded an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was gone. What remained was a sick man who could barely remember his own past, let alone plan criminal enterprises. Payback, news of Capone's condition leaked to the press. Journalists who had once written thousands of words about his crimes and his trial now wrote brief, almost pitying articles about the fallen gangster living as an invalid in Florida. Some of these stories were exaggerated, claiming that Capone spent his days digging for imaginary treasure, or that he believed he was still running Chicago from his Florida mansion. The reality was less dramatic but more tragic. He simply existed, day by day, his great mind reduced to fragments, his powerful body weakened and failing. His son Sonny, now an adult, visited when he could, along with other family members. They tried to maintain some semblance of normal family life, celebrating holidays, sharing meals, pretending that things were not as terrible as they were. But everyone could see the truth. Al Capone was dying slowly, his body and mind betraying him bit by bit, the man he had been erasing itself like a painting left in the rain. The syphilis continued its work. Capone suffered from severe headaches, experienced tremors and seizures, and occasionally lost consciousness. The disease had damaged not just his brain, but also his cardiovascular system, weakening his heart and blood vessels. Every day brought new challenges, new symptoms, new evidence of the body's decline. In late January 1947, Capone suffered a stroke. His condition, already precarious, deteriorated rapidly. He developed bronchial pneumonia, a common complication in patients who were bedridden or immobile. The infection settled in his lungs, making it difficult to breathe, his body fighting battles on multiple fronts and losing them all. Disproportionately, 25th, 1947, surrounded by his family at his Palm Island estate, Alphonse Gabriel Capone suffered cardiac arrest and died. He was 48 years old. The immediate cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest following a stroke, but the underlying cause was the neurosyphilis that had been destroying him for years. In a way, his death was a mercy, an end to years of suffering and confusion, a release from the prison of his own failing body. The news of Capone's death made headlines across the country, but the stories were shorter than they had been in his heyday, and the tone was different. This was not the death of a dangerous criminal who needed to be stopped. This was the end of an era, the passing of a man who had come to symbolize a particular moment in American history. Many of the articles noted that Capone had already been gone for years in any meaningful sense, that what died on January 25th was merely the biological remnant of someone who had ceased to exist long before. The funeral arrangements were made quickly. The family wanted to avoid a spectacle, to give Al what dignity they could in death, since he had been denied so much in his final years. The body was prepared for transport back to Chicago,
to the city where Capone had made his name and his fortune, where he had ruled as a king and where he had fallen. It was the city he had never really left, even during all those years in Atlanta and Alcatraz and Palm Island. The casket was taken to Chicago's Central Station in early February, transported under an assumed name to avoid attracting crowds. Even so, word leaked out, and people gathered to watch as the heavy bronze casket was unloaded and taken to a funeral home. A blanket of gardenias topped with orchids covered the coffin, expensive flowers for a man who had once spent money as freely as water. The funeral service was held privately, attended only by family and a few close friends who had remained loyal through the years of imprisonment and illness. Capone's mother, Teresa, now in her 80s, attended despite her grief and age. She became hysterical at the gravesite, overcome with emotion at the loss of her son, remembering perhaps not the gangster he had become, but the child he had been, the boy born in Brooklyn so many years ago, with all the hopes and possibilities of any immigrant's child. May Capone stood at the grave with their son Sonny, along with Al's brothers Ralph and Matt. Approximately 15 limousines brought mourners to Mount Olivet Cemetery on the far south side of Chicago, where a plot had been purchased in the family section. The ceremony was brief and simple. Prayers were said, tears were shed, and then Al Capone's body was lowered into the ground. The grave would later be moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, where it remains today, marked by a simple black granite headstone that reads, Alphonse Capone, 1899–1947. My Jesus mercy. The epitaph was chosen by May, a final prayer for a man whose life had been defined by actions that showed little mercy to others. Epilogue. Legacy and Lessons. More than 3/4 of a century after his death, Al Capone remains one of the most recognized names in American history. His story has been told and retold in hundreds of books, countless films, and numerous television shows. He has become a symbol, an icon, a representation of a particular era when crime and corruption seemed to rule American cities, when prohibition made criminals rich and powerful, when the line between the underworld and the legitimate world blurred almost to invisibility. One's actual legacy. What does his story teach us about crime, about society, about the American experiment itself? Colonization. Capone's life demonstrates the consequences of prohibition, one of the greatest social experiments in American history and, by most measures, one of its greatest failures. The 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, was intended to reduce crime, improve public health, and strengthen American families. Instead, it created a massive black market that enriched criminals, corrupted law enforcement, and led to unprecedented levels of violence. Capone did not create prohibition, but he exploited it brilliantly, turning the public's desire for illegal alcohol into a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The lesson here is clear. When governments criminalize activities that large portions of the population wish to engage in, they create opportunities for organized crime. The same dynamic that enriched bootleggers in the 1920s would later enrich drug traffickers, illegal gambling operations, and countless other criminal enterprises. Capone's success was built on a fundamental policy failure, a reminder that the law alone cannot change human behavior, and that attempts to do so through prohibition often create worse problems than they solve. Second, Capone's story reveals the depths of corruption that can take root when criminal organizations become wealthy enough to purchase influence. At the height of his power, Capone owned police officers, judges, politicians at every level of government. He could operate with near impunity because the people who were supposed to enforce the law were on his payroll. This was not the corruption of a few bad actors, it was systemic corruption that compromised entire institutions. The fact that it took federal intervention to bring down Capone, that local and state authorities proved incapable or unwilling to act, speaks to how deeply the rot had spread.
Chicago's reputation as a corrupt city, a reputation it struggles with to this day, was earned during the Prohibition era, when gangsters like Capone operated openly and with apparent immunity. The lesson here is about the importance of institutional integrity, about the need for checks and balances that can resist corruption, about the danger of allowing criminal organizations to accumulate enough wealth to purchase the protections that should be the exclusive domain of law-abiding citizens. Third, Capone's rise and fall demonstrates the limits of violence as a tool for maintaining power. Capone used violence liberally throughout his career, eliminating rivals, intimidating witnesses, establishing dominance through fear. In the short term, this strategy worked. His willingness to use force more readily and more ruthlessly than his competitors allowed him to consolidate control over Chicago's underworld. But violence attracts attention, and attention brings scrutiny. Razzia, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, perhaps the most famous violent act associated with Capone, achieved its immediate tactical objective of crippling the North Side gang. But it also turned public opinion decisively against him. The massacre transformed Capone from a colorful character into a menace that needed to be stopped. It gave federal authorities the political support they needed to pursue him aggressively. In trying to eliminate his enemies, Capone created the conditions that would eliminate him. Violence, in the end, proved to be a tool that destroyed its wielder. Fourth, Capone's story is a reminder of the human cost of the criminal life. Behind the glamorous image of expensive suits and celebrity appearances was a trail of bodies, of lives destroyed, of communities torn apart. The men he killed were not just rival gangsters, but also innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. The prostitution rings he ran exploited women. The gambling operations he controlled ruined families. The political corruption he financed undermined democratic institutions. And ultimately, the life destroyed Al Capone himself. His untreated syphilis, contracted in one of the brothels where he worked, slowly ate away at his brain until nothing remained of the man who had commanded an empire. He died at 48, his mind gone, his power vanished, his name associated not with success, but with violence and brutality. The money he made, the power he wielded, all of it proved temporary and ultimately worthless. What remained was suffering and a legacy of harm. The story reveals something about the American tendency to romanticize outlaws. During his peak, Capone was treated like a celebrity by many Americans. He was cheered at baseball games, interviewed by journalists who treated him like a legitimate businessman, admired for his success by people who knew exactly how he made his money. The myth of the Robin Hood gangster, the idea that Capone was somehow providing a service by supplying illegal alcohol and that his charitable activities somehow offset his crimes, was accepted by a surprising number of people. Polluted historicization obscures reality. Capone was not a hero, not a Robin Hood, not even a particularly sympathetic character. He was a criminal who became wealthy by providing illegal goods and services, who maintained his position through violence and corruption, who left Chicago worse than he found it. The tendency to romanticize such figures, to focus on their charisma and success while minimizing their crimes, remains a problem in American culture. We continue to make heroes out of people who should be understood as cautionary examples. Finally, Capone's story is fundamentally a human tragedy. He was born into an immigrant family that had come to America seeking opportunity. His parents were honest, hard-working people who tried to give their children better lives. In a different world, with different choices, Al Capone might have been a successful businessman, a community leader, someone who contributed positively to society. He was intelligent, charismatic, capable of inspiring loyalty, skilled at organization and management. These are not the qualities of a monster, they are the qualities of a leader. But the path he chose, to waste and destruction.
His talents were applied to criminal enterprises rather than legitimate ones. His intelligence was used to evade justice rather than create value. His charisma inspired loyalty among criminals rather than among citizens. And in the end, he lost everything: his freedom, his health, his mind, and ultimately, his life. He died confused and broken, barely aware of who he was or what he had been, reduced to a shadow of himself by a disease he contracted as a young man and was too ashamed or too reckless to treat. The city of Chicago has long since moved past the Prohibition era. The speakeasies have been replaced by legal bars and restaurants. The gang wars are history. The Chicago outfit that Capone built and led still exists in some form, but is a pale shadow of what it once was, decimated by federal prosecutions and changing economics. The landmarks associated with Capone, the hotels where he held court, the garage where the St. Valentine's Day massacre occurred, most of these have been demolished or repurposed. The city has tried to move beyond its gangster past, though it has never fully escaped the association. Capone's grave in Mount Carmel Cemetery receives visitors regularly, people who come to see the final resting place of America's most famous gangster. Some come out of historical interest, others out of a morbid fascination with true crime, still others because they have somehow romanticized the life and want to pay homage. The simple black granite headstone offers no explanations, no justifications, only a name and dates and a plea for divine mercy. The story of Al Capone is ultimately a story about choices and consequences. It is about how poverty and limited opportunity can push young men toward crime. It is about how a society's laws can create criminals, and how those criminals can corrupt the institutions meant to stop them. It is about the seductive power of wealth and the corrosive effects of violence. It is about the temporary nature of power and the permanence of consequence. Forgiveness. It is a reminder that behind every notorious criminal is a human being, someone who was once a child with parents who loved him, someone who made choices that led down a dark path, someone who ultimately paid a terrible price for those choices. Capone lived a life that seemed glamorous from the outside, but was built on a foundation of violence and exploitation. He died young, his mind destroyed, having lost everything that mattered, leaving behind a legacy of harm that far outweighed whatever good he might have done. We remember Al Capone not because his life was admirable, but because it was instructive. His story teaches us about the dangers of organized crime, the costs of corruption, the failures of prohibition, and the ultimate emptiness of power built on illegal foundations. It reminds us that the American dream can be twisted into something dark when pursued through criminal means, that success built on the suffering of others is no success at all. In the end, Al Capone was a man who had everything and lost everything, who commanded an empire and died an invalid, who was feared by thousands and pitied by those who saw him at the end. His life was a spectacular rise and a tragic fall, a story that continues to fascinate because it touches on fundamental questions about crime, society, and the nature of power itself. The name Al Capone will likely be remembered as long as people study American history. But let it be remembered not as the name of a hero or a role model, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when talent is misdirected, when ambition lacks morality, when power is pursued without regard for the harm it causes. Let it be remembered so that future generations might learn from his mistakes rather than repeat them. Constituted on Alcatraz remains empty. The empire has crumbled to dust. The man who seemed so powerful in life proved fragile in death. And the only legacy that truly endures is the lesson his story teaches, that no amount of wealth or power can protect us from the consequences of our choices, that the life we build through crime and violence will eventually collapse, and that in the end, we are all accountable for what we have done.